Okay. Okay. Maggie, I'll turn your video and camera, microphone off until 4 o'clock then.
Okay, lovely. All right. So that's it then. They'll just come on and I'll speak. I won't hear you again, or will I?
When you see your face come up on screen, you know it's time to go.
To go. Fine. Okay. Thank you.
Jesus.
Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Inner Room for our time of prayer together before the last of our online panel sessions, which today is on sharing authority. So in a moment, I'll start with a prayer and then you'll see a candle on screen and you'll hear some music. And we have about 15 minutes to pray together quietly. And then before the session concludes, I'll come back in with another prayer before we hand over to get ready for today's panel discussion. Okay, so let's become quiet together now and open ourselves to God. And as we do so, we hear the words of Jesus, who said to us, "I am among you as one who serves." His calling is to shared service, bringing all his people together in mutual relationship and servant leadership, that all may know and exercise their gifts and their calling in following Christ, bringing him in loving service to the world. So let us be still together now. So, wherever we are in the world, joining in this time and space together, Holy Spirit, come, be with us. Be with us now as we move towards our panel discussion on sharing authority. We come to you asking that you will help us to deeply listen to each other, that you will open our hearts and our minds as we journey together to create a safe, inclusive, and loving church, always with Jesus as our inspiration and our guide. In his name, amen.
Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth day of the Root and Branch Inclusive Lay-Led Synod. I am Colm Holmes, Chair of We Are Church International, and I am also a member of the Root and Branch core team. Root and Branch began in January 2020 before the pandemic. We were responding to journalist Joanna Moorhead's challenge in the tablet that the Catholic Church needed a synod that starts with women rather than tagging them on the end or ignoring them altogether. Very soon, as the name suggests, we understood that we needed to look at all areas of reform in the Church. As we have been joined by more and more people, it has become clear that Root and Branch is not a single issue movement. Women may have started it, but it would not end there. The pandemic lockdown and the rise in online forums allowed us to embark in October 2020 on an online journey of discernment towards an inclusive, lay-led synod. We have listened to speakers from all over the world, both online and quietly in correspondence. We have been open to, and we have actively sought out, opinion from all sections of the Church. We have been accompanied by prayer, and we trust the guiding inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We hope that our thinking has matured and deepened, that we have become more inclusive, at the same time as learning to be more bravely challenging. For months, we have been preparing the Bristol text to reform. It is a document that embodies at least some of the discoveries we have made. It exists both in a readily accessible form, which you will see this evening, and in much more complex, learned forms for those who want to explore more deeply. If you've been with us on our journey, you will have contributed in forums and breakout groups to the Bristol text, and we thank you for that. The Bristol text to reform is intended to give ordinary Catholics across the world the reassurance that there are changes we can make in our practice that are in keeping with the best of Catholic tradition and have the endorsement of deep, pastorally sensitive and well-informed thinkers and theologians. It also offers practical and often challenging visions for the Church, calling it to be Christ-like in its structures, its thinking, and its practice. So this week is the culmination of our year-long journey. This evening's panel has been preparing for that part of the Bristol text that considers sharing authority. Then on Thursday, we ask you to join us in prayer for the Synod from 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. On Friday, midday, we begin our wonderful weekend firework display of speakers, both online and in Bristol, led by Mary McAleese, Helena Kennedy, and James Carroll. We will end next Sunday with a celebration of Word and Communion, followed by lunch in an agape of inclusion. But back to tonight. The format for this afternoon is simple. We will introduce our panel and they will discuss the 3 short form statements they have come up with. There will be more backup documents, of course. Our short statements tonight are designed to be clear and straightforward and easy to manage in this medium. At the end, we will have some time for the panel to answer your questions. Please email rbsynodchat@gmail.com to submit questions. That email address is rbsynodchat@gmail.com. My colleagues Penelope Middlebow and Mary Ring will be asking the questions you send in. Naturally, with hundreds of audience members, we will only be able to tackle a sample, but there will be a survey after the Synod where we'd welcome your thoughts and contributions. For now, let me introduce your chair for this evening. Virginia Saldana is a woman activist, writer, and theologian living in Mumbai, India. She is currently secretary of the Indian Women Theologians Forum and a member of Ecclesia of Women in Asia. She is a co-founder of Rainbow Catholics India and a member of their steering committee. She is coordinator of the Mumbai unit of Indian Christian Women's Movement. She is a member of the executive team of Catholic Women's Council. She previously occupied positions in the Catholic Church commissioned for the empowerment of women at the diocesan, national, and international level as executive secretary of the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, FABC, Women's Desk, and later of the FABC Office of Laity and Family. She is a former member of the Executive Council of Pax Christi International. Over to you, Virginia.
Thank you, Colin. Welcome, friends, to this presentation by the panel on authority in the Catholic Church at this Root and Branch Synod. I deeply appreciate this initiative of women in Root and Branch, United Kingdom. The synodal process cannot be overemphasized if we want to see change from the top-down process of decision-making and authority to one of communion, participation, and mission. I have great pleasure in introducing our panel members who have worked together over the past 3 months to bring out this statement. Though the statement seems so brief, believe me, there is a lot of reference material that went into our discussions to bring us to these 3 important points. You can access and read the reference material through Root and Branch. We have 4 members besides myself on the panel, who are Christina Rees, Baroness Helena Kennedy, Luca Bandini, Confaloneri, and Presbyter Tony Cassidy, who is unable, unfortunately, to join us this evening. Christina Rees is a writer, broadcaster, and practical theologian specializing in women and religion. She was a leading campaigner and spokeswoman for women bishops. She is chair of Watch, Women and the Church. For over 13 years, she was a lay member of the, for over 13 years. She was a lay member of the Church of England's General Synod for 25 years and a founder member of the Archbishops' Council, the body that advises the Archbishops of Canterbury and York on matters of policy and resources. He has sat on numerous national church committees and is an honorary fellow of Ripon College, Cuddesson, a leading Anglican theological college. In 2016, the Queen awarded Christina a CBE, Commander of the British Empire, for services to the Church of England. She is a school chaplain and will be ordained in September 2021. Baroness Helena Kennedy is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have least power within the system, championing civil liberties and promoting human rights. She has acted in many prominent cases of terrorism, official secrets, and homicide. She is the founding force behind the establishment of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. In 1997, she was elevated to the House of Lords, where she is a Labour peer. She has published 2 books on how the justice system is failing women and has written and broadcasted on many issues over the years. Currently, she has taken on the role of director to the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She directs the institute's work upholding the rule of law and human rights globally. She has received several awards and has several publications to her name. Dr. Luca Bandini Confaloneri is the Executive Director in the Weingarts Institute of Catholic Research. He has a long-standing interest in the governance of the Roman Catholic Church. He is the author of Democracy in the Christian Church. His research at the Institute focuses on women's equality within the Roman Catholic Church, as well as working to improve Catholic social ethics, with a particular attention the ethics of family planning and LGBT relationships, given the impact current papal teachings have on those issues on women and men worldwide. Luca is also interested in translating academic findings about those issues into accessible educational material. He is the Partnership and Networking Officer at Catherine of Siena, Roehampton University, and was a former researcher at University of Birmingham. He has contributed as academic consultant to the documentary Jesus' Female Disciples, The New Evidence. And finally, our fourth member, Tony Cassidy, who is a presbyter and currently the parochial administrator at St. Matthew's at Norwood West. He is trained in biblical studies at the Biblical Institute in Rome. He did most of his theological studies in mixed classes at the University of Kent at Canterbury, which entailed a foundation year of general humanities courses, including one on socialism, communism, and culture. Wow, that is quite an atypical education for the clerical class. He has gained a lot of his knowledge through extensive reading. We miss Tony's voice here today. Can we have the first slide, please? Over to you, Christina.
I think I'm on the second slide, aren't I? I thought I was going second.
Yeah, this should be Helena, I think.
Yes.
Yes, I've got. Listen, I'm going to apologise to everybody. I've got the thing in front of me, but my computer's not working very well today, and I'm having difficulty reading the right-hand side of it. So I wonder if someone would read it for me, and then I will be happy to speak to it later. Could you read it for me, Christine?
Yes, I can. Jesus preached the good news of the historical advent of the kingdom of God, which brings justice and peace to all human beings and liberation to the oppressed. For the Catholic Church to cooperate with God's kingdom, it needs to model its organizational structure and its canon law on those principles of equality and justice for all.
Thank you very much. And that's very much the argument that I made in our group. Now, I'm going to just speak very briefly to it. I have practiced in the law for many, many years, over 40 years. And as a lawyer and as a woman, I began to apply a critical eye to our own legal system in the United Kingdom and to the ways in which it failed women. And I'm afraid that once one has developed that sort of critical eye, then it's going to apply even closer to home, to our, if you like, our spiritual rules. And one of the things that has become clear to me is that law's failings everywhere around the world have come about largely because law is man-made, and the canon law is essentially man-made too, and it's come out of a patriarchal system and a patriarchal time, which basically privileged the position of men in society. And so it's not going to be surprising that it often fails women. And it's been a source of regret to me that our church, which is so committed to the poor, to the marginalized, to changing the ways in which our world works to the disadvantage of so many, fails to really address the inequalities that there are as with regard to gender and sex. I also am concerned about the total preoccupation that the church seems to have with sexuality, and fails to recognize that sexuality, rather than being something which automatically is associated with sinfulness, is actually an expression of our humanity. And so many of the scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church in recent years have derived from those inequalities, those discriminations, but also the failure to really understand humankind in all its facets. Think of the sexual abuse scandal. Think of the ways in which women, for example, were forced to have their children adopted if they had them outside of marriage. The shame attached to women over their loss of virginity if it was outside of marriage. The burdens of shame that women have had to carry on so many fronts. And I'm afraid that the church doesn't come out well from all of this, and doesn't come out well from it because it has often placed reputational risk and so on ahead of the suffering of the individual victims, particularly when it came to the sexual abuse scandals. And so I'm afraid that the canon law falls short of all the standards that we would expect of legal systems in a world where human rights have become much more in focus, and human rights are about human dignity and respect for our common humanity. So I'm sure that some people would like to pick up some of those points.
The second slide, can we have the second slide, please?
Yes.
And over to Christina.
Yes, this is the second one, entitled Agreed by All. What touches all must be discussed and approved by all. By virtue of their common baptism, all adult Catholics have the fundamental right to participate and vote in all decisions on matters of doctrine, value, action, and any other issue concerning the common good of their community. At every level, representative democratic councils should serve as the principal decision-making bodies with the inalienable right to determine what falls within their competence. Discernment belongs to all. It cannot be confined to the few. Now, my comments, I hope, pick up on that theme and maybe inspire some of your own thinking, because both my theology and my experience have convinced me that the best way for a church to make decisions which affect all its members and which also affect many more people who are not necessarily its members is to do so in such a representative, democratically elected body, inclusive of both male and female, ordained and lay. This is, of course, not some newfangled notion that disregards history and tradition. When we read in the Acts of the Apostles, we can detect the beginnings of the principle of commonality, of orthodoxy being the responsibility of the group, taught and led by those who at that time had walked with Jesus. We can see the emergence of the commonality of teaching by the apostles and commonality of decision-making. Initially, there were no synods or councils as such, but the apostles were eager to share what they had learned, as well as to raise up other faithful teachers and preachers, think of Priscilla and Aquila, to pass on the teaching and the faith, both in belief and practice, both orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And it is important to mention Priscilla and Aquila, a husband and wife team, or perhaps more accurately, a wife and husband team, because Paul always mentions Priscilla first, which was a recognized way at that time of indicating seniority. By the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and that was the first Christian gathering held with the goal of finding a consensus across Christendom, the surrounding patriarchal culture had closed in on the freedom and inclusivity of the early church, and women no longer played leading roles within the public structures and ordained hierarchy of the church. That first council contained those who were the public and ecclesiological leaders and thinkers. The radical inclusivity of the gospel that Jesus lived and preached had already morphed into a male-only clerical hierarchy. Does this matter? Certainly these men and their successors would have taken their roles seriously, and most would have strived faithfully to ensure that they made good decisions in keeping with the faith. But it hasn't worked out like that. And over the centuries, the doctrines, laws, and practices of the Christian churches have strayed far from the anchor and touchstone of Jesus Christ. By ignoring and denying the insight, wisdom, and experience of half the human race, the church became impoverished and skewed and hard and judgmental and ultimately cruel, blinkered, and blind. If there had been synods of men and women, clergy and laity, would the Crusades have been given the go-ahead? The Inquisition, the witch hunts? As much research makes clear, having equal numbers of women and men on decision-making bodies produces the best results in terms of how the group works together, and in the case of the business world, results that can even be measured in terms of revenue and profit. Again, this call for the equality of men and women is based on our theology, because we can see in the very first chapter of Genesis the creation of the world and of humanity expressed so beautifully and with such tenderness and love by a God who speaks of the God self as us, first hint of God as Trinity. Males and females were created together as equal halves of a greater whole, and together given the charge of being fruitful, caring for the earth, and together blessed. There was a true mutuality between them. Together, men and women were created in God's image with no suggestion at all of an internal hierarchy in the human race. Sadly, that came later, and because of the succeeding generations of patriarchal culture, that is the pattern that developed and that was enforced. And it's not just the lack of women's participation in the church's hierarchy that is impoverishing the church. Moving into the New Testament, Paul speaks eloquently about what he calls the body of Christ, the group of all those who believe. Every single believer matters, with Christ as the head. Of course, the teaching must be passed on throughout the generations by those who will guard the truth as they understand and interpret it. But in the body of Christ, everyone belongs, everyone contributes. The body collectively suffers if every member is not enabled to express and live out his or her gifts. And how deeply the body has been suffering in the churches in which a privileged elite can position itself as above and remove from the rules that they would use to wield power and to discipline others. The lack of accountable, representable, democratically elected synods of bishops, clergy, and laity has without a doubt contributed to bad decisions about doctrine and practice, and it's also created a climate in which hypocrisy and abuse can flourish. Of course, the move by Pope Gregory in 1075 requiring priests to be celibate, and that was formalized by the First Lateran Council in 1123. That also contributed to the widespread incidence of abuse that we see now. But what was done then can be undone now. Remember, the church had for married clergy for very nearly as long as it has had a celibate priesthood. For our missional imperative today, is it time to change? I'd like to end with the words of the writer John Rosebank, who in a recent article about the goals of this Root and Branch Synod suggests that the Bristol text will encourage a new relationship between clergy and laity. It will restate the accepted theological fact that the magisterium belongs not to the few, but to all. And a clerical hierarchy that claims a monopoly of judgment is not only counter to the teaching of the Gospels, but in fact a very recent origin. The importance of such a text would be that it could be put into action straight away. It would immediately liberate ordinary parishioners from fearful subservience to bishops and parish clergy, and at once support direct lay action and education. Above all, such a text would offer the church a resolution to its most pressing current conundrum: how to make its teaching useful in widely differing periods and contexts. Amen to that.
Thank you, Christina. Can we now have the third slide and over to Luca?
Thank you. So the third slide reads, "The one who is to preside over all should be elected by all. Legitimate authorities in the church must be based on the consent of the people. The church community has the right to evaluate, approve, and commission all those putting themselves forward for a ministry. Every adult Catholic has the right to vote for and to be eligible as a candidate for any church ministry. All Catholics also have the right to have their leaders render an account to them." Now, just a couple of points of comment to these. You will have noticed that the election of church officials is closely related to the authority of and the importance of councils and synods. And this is because if we go back to the last millennium until the First Vatican Council, we see within Western Christendom or Western Catholicism at the very least, that the dominant tradition of thought about church governance by medieval theologians was one called conciliarism. The best and brightest thinkers about church governance understood that the authority of councils and of synods was based on the fact that there were representative gatherings of the church. So a council or a synod had as much authority to the extent that they were representative of the insights, of the experiences, of the values, of the needs of the local churches. So if you have church officials, bishops first and foremost, who are elected, directly, democratically elected by a local church, you start really, a snowball effect in terms of church reform. And of course, like Christina said about councils, the election of bishops as well is nothing new. It was the dominant practice throughout the earliest centuries, the first millennium of church life. Many of you will know that St. Ambrose was democratically acclaimed to Bishop of Milan in 374, I believe, 374. He was acclaimed, he was elected as Bishop of Milan by popular acclamation when he was still pagan. He was not even baptized yet. The people, the church, the local church of Milan knew of him, loved him, asked him to become bishop. He accepted. Within 8 days, he was sort of baptized and ordained bishop. And he went on to be one of the most successful early bishops in the world, and the mentor to St. Augustine, etc. The point is, can we imagine the consequences of reintroducing the practice of episcopal elections, democratic episcopal elections? What if people today were to elect a woman? What if they were to elect a gay person in a same-sex relationship? The ancients said, vox populi, vox Dei. They sort of made the point that the will of the people was an expression of God's will. So there is a lot that can happen if the election of church officials is reintroduced. And this is it, really. My only two comments is, first, that it's nothing new. Secondly, that it can have unexpected, wonderful consequences. And maybe the third point, of course, is that it will be good to see all those points as linked to each other. So the election of bishops and the importance of communal decision-making are closely linked. You can have communal decision-making at the representative level, as long as, church officials are truly representative of the people and not part of a sort of separate, sort of set aside, which was the original meaning of the word clergy, clerical caste almost, which is self-perpetuating, male only, all the problems that sort of we are, I'm sure, familiar with. So I will close with this, and if any of the other panelists or Virginia want to take up from this.
Thank you, Luca, for explaining to us the third point. And now I will hand over to Penelope and Mary to please read out the questions. And I call upon the panel to come forward so that one of you can answer.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. This is a sort of two-point question. Where does the quote, "What touches all must be discussed and approved by all," come from? Didn't Pope Francis say something similar recently? And that leads on to, surely the question of democratic government, including all, is the most important thing here. It includes women, but how do we start to include everyone?
Luca?
Yes. So starting with the quote, "What touches all must be discussed and approved by all," it goes back to Roman law, actually. There is an awful lot of Roman law which Christians took into church law because it made perfect sense. It became really, really important tenet of church governance during the Middle Ages, and it continued to be so. It became incorporated in the Decretum Gratiani, which is sort of the first collection of church law, I think 12th century or 13th century. Somebody might correct me, but basically it's a very important text. It incorporated this saying so as to show just how important this principle was for church life and church governance. And it remains central. I mean, it's been very much set aside maybe over the last century and a half or 2 centuries. But, you know, we need to be aware that the Catholic tradition is much richer than the sort of narrow, very authoritarian outfit that we see nowadays. So that, and what was the second bit of the question?
Oh, sorry, it was just surely the question of democratic government, including all, is the most important thing here. It includes women, but how do we start?
I'm happy to have a go at that and then throw that back to the other panel members. Speaking as a member of the Church of England, but someone who's walked very closely with the Catholic Church in working for reform, my experience is that it's once you open it up, it becomes very straightforward. You start by saying, we have these bodies, or perhaps we need another body, another synod, and then you decide the criteria for election. You open up the elections to everyone, and in the Church of England, the elections to our prime decision-making body, in fact, apart from Parliament, it's the only other body in England that can make law, and that's the General Synod. That's the body I served on for 25 years. And there are 3 houses in it: the House of Bishops, clergy, and laity. And all bishops are on by default, so they don't even have to have elections. But because we have assistant bishops called suffragans, there are elections among the suffragans, and 4 of those get elected as well. And then in the clergy, it is the other clergy who elect their fellow clergy. And so that is how that is done, and that is done in dioceses. And then in terms of the laity, it is lay people who vote for and elect other lay people. And of course, they're all the minutiae of writing election addresses, holding hustings, and being open, and then some rules and boundaries about, so to get a uniformity of approach. And then there are other special constituencies like the universities, the religious, and various other much, much smaller groups. So the House of Laity is by far the biggest house on a body of 500. And it's once you break through that sort of sound barrier of what's happening there, it is straightforward.
Can I come in on this? When the Church of England, when the women in the Church of England were organizing some 30 years ago, some of them came to me because I had just been speaking publicly and writing about the way in which law failed women. I had called a book Eve Was Framed, and it was basically looking at the way in which somehow women got blamed for so many of the crimes committed, often by their menfolk. And but it was really an analysis of law's failures and how that came about, and how basically our societies, which were built around, the sort of the privilege of men, and men being those who had power, that the secondary position of women meant that they were not there in laws making. And that's been true of the church too. And so I got involved, actually, despite being a Catholic, I got involved in the struggle of women. And Christina was someone I knew and admired and listened to. I'm not a theologian, and I don't pretend to be, but I was in learning mode about how they went through this. Now you've got to remember, it's taken nearly 30 years for the Church of England to get to this place. So this is a long game. So if you were to say to me, what do you do? In the first instance, I think that the church has to do away with the business of celibacy. I think that has to go, because I think that has been one of the root problems in so many of the issues that we're talking about. People are sexual beings. Some people might choose to be celibate, and so be it. But there should be the ability to become, to follow a vocation, even if you are a married person, male or female or whatever. So I just think that you deal with that first and foremost. You deal with the business of the Catholic Church's hostility to homosexuality, because it's been at the base of so many of the problems that the Church has faced. And I went on a visit to the Vatican, hoping to make some headway with some lawyers to try to persuade the Church to actually make a statement about decriminalizing homosexuality, making a statement to the world, because research that we've done in the Institute of Human Rights that I run, it showed that in places where there was criminal law, which was introduced, let it be clear, from from Britain, actually, in our colonizing, and we created criminal laws in all parts of the world that we colonized, and then it spread to other places. But and that's not to say that there wasn't, of course, moral opprobrium of people who might be homosexual, but it was about failing to understand people's sexuality. And when we went to Rome, one of the men who came with me was a very senior judge who'd been on the Supreme Court, they call it the High Court of Australia, and he's a homosexual who has been with his own partner for 54 years. And he's sat in the highest court in his land. And he said, and we made presentations to the senior cardinal to say, in places where homosexuality is criminalized, the persecution of homosexuals is huge, is terrible, where you see murder and grievous assaults and the most terrible abuse. And it correlates to the criminalization. And if the Church were to say that states around the world should be looking at whether they need to have these laws and whether they aren't a failure in terms of embracing everyone in all of our differences. But the judge, Michael Kirby, said to the cardinal, when I was a child, I knew by the time I was 6 or 7 that I was different. But already I had breathed in the sense that to be homosexual, to like boys and want, in my dreams about it was to be with a boy. He said, when I was 7 and 8, I couldn't tell the people I loved most in the world because I was fearful that I would lose their love. And what does that do to a family where people feel that they have some dark secret that they have to keep to themselves? And the point he made was that now our knowledge of humanity has developed, and science and so on has helped us to understand sexuality so much better. And we've just had, if you just look at what we had in Ireland recently, with a country that was, in many ways, people would have said that the Church had the dominant role in terms of power and authority. And the people of Ireland, by a majority, voted to have gay marriage. And it was because the Catholic grandmothers and the Catholic mothers and fathers said, why should our child not have the same right to be with the person they love as our other child? And so all I would say to you is, there is a rebellion around the world on so much of this. And it really is about being lacking compassion and lacking a respect for the dignity of others' humanity. So I feel very strongly that you have to have abandon the business of celibacy, deal with the business of homosexuality, because many men found their way to the priesthood because they thought it would help them repress these terrible, terrible sinful urges they had. And that was why, we've had men in the priesthood having homosexual relationships, men who have basically subverted and corrupted their own sexuality, which led to then abuse of children. So all I would say is we have to deal with that first, and we have to stop being so preoccupied and fetishistic about sex within the Church and start concerning ourselves with suffering of the world.
I've got loads.
So those are the things I think we start with, and then you start with the business of that change would create sort of, if you like, a return to the church by so many, a respect for the church by the young who are becoming disengaged. And I think it would start the process of change.
Mary, can we have the next question, please? You are muted.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
Lovely. Thank you. I've just lost the question a minute, so giving me a second to get back to it. This question says, is there any way in which we can influence reform of canon law to bring it up to international standards, as referenced in Helena's talk? Would Helena be in a position to contribute to any work on this at the Vatican?
Well, the person who has been really looking at this is my friend Mary McAleese, who was the President of Ireland, because when her period of office ended, she went, in fact, to Rome and she studied canon law, and it was with the intention of looking at it through a different, if you like, prism. And it's always been a disappointment to me that the church, I mean, the idea of the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War and atrocities and horrors was to say, how do we create a value system, a template of values against which every legal system should be measured? So it wouldn't matter whether you had a common law system or a constitutional system that laid it down, or whether it was codified, or whether you had a Sharia law system. There still should be this template, and it should measure what you're doing. And at the base of it, of course, was that whole business of human dignity, stuff that the language that so fits with the Catholic Church. Why has the Catholic Church not embraced it properly? And of course, it hasn't done, and particularly with regard to due process, the idea of access to justice. You know, where was the access to justice for the many victims of sexual abuse within the church? And then the business of just moving people on who'd committed the crimes. Where was the justice in all of that? And it's one of the reasons why so many people are alienated. They do not see the Catholic Church adhering to that whole framework of human rights, the rule of law, and respect for due process, access to justice, and the treatment of people as being equal before the law. And it's really, just think about Article 2 of the Universal Declaration. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, social origin, property, birth or other status. Now, you know, only in the last weeks, you know, we have had arguments, and I happened to raise it with our own cardinal here in London, the fact that people were very sort of distressed, I would say, and disappointed when they saw the ease with which the Prime Minister, who's not known for his sobriety when it comes to relationships with women, and the ease with which he was able to have a marriage in the Catholic Church, despite the fact of being twice divorced. And let me tell you, I know that people are living much longer, marriages do fail, and people don't go easily into the processes of divorce, and it can be hugely painful for people. But the answer of the Cardinal was that these are the rules that apply to everybody, and he had not ever been married in the Catholic Church before. And all I would say is, then of course, it's a certain class of people in society. If you go to Glasgow, where I'm from, people marry other Catholics, and so they get married in the Catholic Church. But their marriages fail too. And yet I was recently in a car with a driver taking me to take part in Any Questions, the radio program, and he said to me, "You went to school, the Catholic school I went to, you went with my sister." And he talked about his school, and he said, "But I'm now excommunicated." And I said, "Paul, what do you mean?" And he said, "Because my marriage ended after 25 years. And he said, and then I met someone at work and I remarried." And he said, "And now I married a Catholic woman, but she was marrying a divorced man. And so we now, neither of us can consider ourselves Catholics. We're excommunicated." And I said, "Who said that to you?" And he told me the story of not being able to receive communion and the pain that it meant for him. And I just think that these things are the things that are such a scar on the church and on all the people who still think of themselves as being Catholics and who want to be able to take of the sacraments, to be participants, to belong to this family, and yet they are not able to do so. Do I think the canon law should be reviewed? Absolutely. Do I think that we should be revisiting on it some of the standards that we apply to law in other places and in our own systems? Yes, and of course our systems fail, but we have to be applying some of these standards to canon law. And much of it is about the failure to treat people with equality, to treat people with compassion, and to find ways of being inclusive and non-discriminatory.
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Yes. Are we trying to put new tires on a car that no longer works?
Who would be willing to answer that? Luca?
Well, I can give it a go. I mean, it's a very good question. I've I'm not entirely sure myself, but generally it's maybe difficult to rebuild from scratch than maybe to salvage what's there. I mean, the Catholic Church, it's a very big institution, but it's certainly, it's got, we have heard, very big flaws. I think it can be reformed, and the reform needed, must be root and branch for sure. But I'll tell you what's coming to my mind. I once read a review of a book. I haven't got around to reading the book yet, but it was a book. Can't remember the name of the author. This guy worked for the, I think, World Bank. He's Catholic and he's visited a lot of developing countries, and he wrote a book about the Catholic Church in the developing world. And I think, if I understood him correctly, one of the sort of conclusions that he reaches is that is on the basis of what he's seen in the developing world, is that most of the initiatives of the Catholic Church in the developing world, whether it's for social care, hospitals, schools, education, you name it, come from the bottom up. And only after they've been more or less well established, then the hierarchy sort of jumps in and takes control, or sort of provides assistance. Now, of course, in a healthy community, it's precisely at the startup stage that you need the institutional support, that you need the community behind you. And that's what's lacking. And it's lacking because the government structure of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy is out of touch, is not representative, is basically not representative and not really in touch with what's going on. And so they can't easily lead. They don't have buy-in to lead. So it's very much a sort of cultic, a Catholicism very much limited to the sacristy, and everything that has been done outside the sacristy, university, schools, etc., historically has come from the bottom up, very much so. From religious orders, from lay people getting together and doing things. Having said that, as I say, ideally you would need the governing officials as well, the sort of political structures that this way to be behind those initiatives, not leave them by themselves, and only step in when their contribution is not really necessary any longer. But I'll pass this to Helena.
Well, Virginia, I think that we should be hearing from you too, because you were a very important voice in our group when we had our discussions. I'm a firm believer in reform. I've spent my life being involved in reform of one thing or another, and I do believe that there's so many good things about the teachings of the Church. And I feel that it has given me a value system where I often fail, but where I seek to do better every day. And in my contemplation, I return to that learning. But what I do feel is that in reforming, you know, the hierarchy has to be persuaded that this is about sustainability. The Catholic Church is not going to survive if it does not address these issues, because the young are just not going to engage, and the young are so clear in their embrace of difference, of racial difference, of sexual difference, their embrace of people's failings and of forgiveness. And I really just think that we are missing so much if the church does not have the good sense to reform. And so I hope that some of the senior people in the church and in the magisterium get wise, because they will not survive. And the second thing is, this is about justice and about compassion and about the very things at the base of the church. If you don't listen to the people, and to the people particularly who are suffering, then you cannot call yourself a Christian church following the teachings of Christ. So I really feel that we have to persuade the leadership that we currently have that they must cede power in order to survive. And the answer to it is, as I have a level of agreement about the business of some way of engaging the people in deciding who should be their bishops and so on. I think that you have to think of ways of doing that. At the moment, what you have is this business of, they'll pick a woman from somewhere. It's like the judiciary in our own system. You know, it started off where we complained and said there are no women in senior roles. And so they would then choose, you know, this woman and that woman who's not going to rock the boat, you know. And so what you do is and what happens to all of us, patriarchy is a way of being. I mean, it's a system of, I mean, I do want you to know that I've been working on a thing with the Scottish Parliament, funnily enough, around misogyny. And misogyny is about male entitlement and so on. But the thing about it is that some people do these things unconsciously. And also women buy into it too, because we're socialized to accept all these things. We're socialized to accept the idea that this is how it ought to be and this is how it's always been, and therefore we can't change it. We can change it, but we have to persuade those involved in it just now that they have a part to play in this, or the whole thing is going to come down brick by brick, and that would be a great sadness to the world.
Amen.
Thank you, Helena. Yeah. Thank you, Helena. The only thing I would like to remind everybody about is the Holy Spirit. I have great hope in the power of the Holy Spirit, and all of us have the power of the Spirit. And I think we have to learn to listen to that Spirit, and we have to kind of get everybody on board. And I think it's we lay people now who have to take it in our hands. And, you know, when I look at Afghanistan, I see a lot of likeness to the church. The people over there have to take on the role of seeing that they have a good government. If they do not, they know that they're lost. So the people are struggling. They're putting their lives on the line. And I think it's we, the people of God, who really have to come together. And I see it happening. I see it happening. Even young people, I'm very much in touch with young people over here. Many of them say, is this happening in the church? And I said, yes, it is happening. People are asking questions. People want change. They walked out thinking that change is not possible. I think each one of us have to spread that message. Change is possible. Let us work towards change. Can we have the next question?
Thank you.
A major outage in the area.
This question, says, it's quite a long one. I need to comment on the point made by Helena that subverted homosexuality in celibate priests has resulted in the abuse crisis. Whilst some abusers may be homosexual, it's important to also be clear that some abusers may not be homosexual. Celibacy. Shall I finish the question? Or it's more of a comment. Celibacy and clerical suppression results in the ordination of emotionally and sexually immature men who have little experience of emotional relationships, and the consequence, sadly, is a subversion of their sexuality, whether heterosexual or homosexual.
I agree entirely, and if my language was loose, I apologize for that, because it's why I go back to the fact that when I was asked, what do you do? I said the first thing you do is deal with the business of celibacy, the sort of obsession with sex, and with the failure to embrace the fact that people can be homosexual as well. But the thing about it is that so much of this is about enforced denial. In some way, and I really feel that it's a failure to understand the whole of our humanity. So absolutely, I agree entirely with whoever the questioner was.
Thank you.
Can we have the next question, please?
Yes. This is about base communities in Brazil. The model of the base communities in Brazil, with the conscientious, I don't know how to pronounce that word, conscientiousization of the ordinary people, or ordinary people being conscious of what's right and what's wrong, led to one woman asking at the induction of a bishop, why has this man been appointed? We haven't been consulted. On our journey with Root and Branch, we had lots of people talking about base communities, but how can we grow base communities in the UK and Ireland so we become fully adult Christians?
Can Luca answer that?
Gladly, because I'm a big fan of base communities or house churches. You don't need any permission, of course, to go ahead and create one. And actually, I'm sure Virginia will have a lot to say as well, because she has done quite a bit of research on the subject. And I think we're both in agreement that this is how Christianity started. It was people meeting in private homes, discussing how they could bring the good news to their neighborhoods in very concrete ways. We are talking about, social problems that were there and that are always with us. And how can the Christians of that area alleviate them, heal what's there, or contribute to healing together with others. So, there have been, I was told by a young researcher actually who did some research on that in Buenos Aires, I think, when possibly Cardinal Bergoglio or Bishop Bergoglio was there at the time. A parish exists apparently that is run by a religious order and has sort of taken the initiative of making house churches or basic leisure communities flourish within the parish territory, and the parish just provides sort of a catalyst point, and weekly meeting maybe, but and it's plenty of initiatives have come up, including like they have the largest fair trade sort of market. And I started like, parishes here maybe have the fair trade stall where you can buy a bit of tea or coffee. They now have an entire street apparently, which is a thriving fair trade market, and it was, organized by the basic community. So my point is, there is no need for permission. This is sort of, we are going back to the origins in a good way. It's just, the hard slog of getting people engaged, involved. It's, building this sort of movement.
Thank you. Yes, actually, that's the origin of our church. The church started at the base. They were house churches in the early church. But of course, when it was taken over by the empire, you got the patriarchal and hierarchical structure. So that was lost. We need to go back there. And I think our faith is best lived in our neighborhood. It is best lived in our neighborhood, where we can live the Eucharist, and we can also celebrate the Eucharist in the neighborhood. Going to these big, huge gatherings, which are so, sort of indifferent. You don't know people, and you just go over there like a crowd. you receive communion, it's hardly sharing a meal together. It's individuals going to kind of a celebration and returning home as individuals. The community is, feeling is probably there when you meet a few people after Mass, but we feel community only in our neighborhoods. I will talk about it more on Saturday, but I feel the small Christian community will be very instrumental in bringing about synodality also in the church. Can we go to the next question, please?
This one says that Luca told us about Ambrose being elected bishop before he converted to Christianity. The people discerned that he was who was needed. Helena's talking about a rebellion of the people, for example, in Ireland on gay marriage. So my question is, how can we make the current hierarchy sit and listen and take the time to discern and not jump to conclusions?
Helena, would you like to answer that?
Well, I have to say that how do we teach people to listen? When a delegation of us as lawyers went to Rome, and we met with the senior cardinal, there was a respectful listening. And the cardinal was there, and to one side of him was a woman. I'm sure she was a sister from a religious order. And on the other side was a young priest. And they listened respectfully. But I left, in fact, feeling very disappointed because I didn't feel that it was the kind of listening. There's listening and listening. And this was not receptive listening. And at the end, I said, I know that diplomacy means that you can welcome people and there an exchange of kind words. But I really want this to be the start of a dialogue about what might be possible and a role that the church could play in the world. And I was promised that it was the start of a dialogue. And well, it's been the dialogue of the death. I'm sorry if that is considered offensive to anybody about the use of language, but there was basically a deliberate unlistening. And I haven't been able to secure that exchange of views and opinions to move forward that one would have hoped for.
Could I just say something on the back of that? Because this raises a really important issue about being listened to, and there's listening and then there's listening with an openness actually to change, to incorporate, to be changed by what you have heard. And it goes back to whose consciences, whose experiences, whose life stories are privileged. Because some people are listened to and, oh my goodness, things change immediately. We can refer to, in a tiny little encapsulated incident, the marriage of the Prime Minister. That just sums up the privileged position of one he exists in, and his story, his desire, his need, his want to get married was listened to and acted upon. You can imagine Helena's cab driver in Glasgow asking for that and being rebuffed before he'd even got to anyone who had the power to make a decision. And I think it's really important to be aware of in going to synodicals and going to in encouraging base communities and all of that, in standing against the phenomenon of clericalism, where only ordained people matter, or the powerful, only the powerful really get listened to. In the abuse scandals, clergy abuse scandals in the Church of England, what has been the repeated experience of people who would call themselves victims, survivors, or just people who have experienced abuse at the hand of clergy, They go and they've been allowed to have audiences with very, very senior people, including the archbishops and other bishops and other senior people. And there's been a kind of listening and some really good words after meetings like that. But what's changed? And I won't take up time to go into the stories of how that's been dealt with, but I just think we have to be aware of who's privileged, whose consciences is listened to, and who gets to choose who will be paid attention to.
You see, when I had the discussion recently about the Boris Johnson situation with our cardinal, his point was, well, he spoke of him as, he said it's the story of the prodigal son, and that I was one of the brothers who was resenting that this prodigal son was being clutched to the bosom of Mother Church or Father Church or whatever, when other folk had behaved well. And it was even suggested that perhaps maybe my view of Boris politically might have coloured it as well. Anyway, all I would say to you is that the point I made was that I don't think that happens for people in Glasgow. My mother was a person at the heart of the community, and women used to come to her, Catholic women who were being abused by their husbands, battered, who were being kept short of money and who could hardly feed their children. Because our husbands drank the money away, all that kind of thing. My mother was there at the heart of all of that. Some of those women left those men because they couldn't survive otherwise, and they were not given the support by the church. And the idea that you'd get the same hearing, people don't even know how to go about this stuff. They don't even know it's available to them. And so, I said, your communication strategy on saying that everybody's equal before the canon law is not working, let me tell you. And you need to do something about that.
Thank you for answering that, Helena and Christina. Can we have the next question, please?
Yes. Question is saying that if we're feeding into the synodal path that the Pope has established, doesn't the bishop's synodal path give them a veto over everything? In which case, how can that give any real access to the laity? And could it start at parish level? But actually, let's answer the first part of it because it's the nub of it, I think.
I think, Luca, would you try to answer that, please?
Yes, you're correct in that according to current canon law, and we go back to the need for radical reform of canon law, synods, including this synodal path, only bishops can have a deliberative power there. So, I mean, I heard recently from Paul Collins, the author of, I think, Papal Power. He's a Australian theologian, and he was telling me, he sent me an article he wrote for an Italian publication on the Australian, they call it the plenary council, I think they call it. It's taking place, I think it's taking place this year and the next. And he's saying that it's, I didn't use the word farce, but, from his description, basically, he doesn't have much hope of anything coming out of it, because there was a call for contributions to the church, and a lot of people wrote in with beautiful sort of suggestions and ideas, etc., just like we are doing here now. And then those contributions were collated by the Central Committee, which was almost entirely clerical, and they were sort of essentially tamed. So that the sort of the agenda and the sort of working document that they have now, it's a much sort of tamed version of what the actual discussion on the ground was like. And it will be further sort of watered down, presumably, in the, I mean, a bit less than half the participants are, lay people, I think, but they don't have voting power. Only bishops and clergy have. So they will be those who decide what to send to Rome. And he's saying, it doesn't have any hope that anything radical will come out of it, because it's been completely corralled. How do you say? So that is a danger, and we will see what happens. I don't see, unless canon law is changed, I don't see how this can change, to be honest. It's part of bringing canon law up with contemporary sort of democratic thought. And let us not forget also that basically this is only the second code of canon law that we have. It was composed in 1983 after the Second Vatican Council. In many ways, it's a rejection of the Second Vatican Council. The previous one was the first ever code of canon law, was only published in 1917, little more than a century ago, 103 years ago. And it was only published more or less as usual. The Catholic Church was following suit with what states were doing. So Napoleon had started the codification of law in France, and modern states kept doing that, followed suit over the next century, and the church a century later decided that to do the same. But it's something very, in a sense, a lot of the laws are ancient. I was mentioning earlier that the Decretum Gratiani goes back to the 13th century, but there were a collection of laws scattered. There was no one single unified, universal code of law for the entire Catholic Church. Now we have it. It's just about a century old. Actually, the current incarnation is 30 years old, less than 40 years old. And it's proved, I think, to be, I won't say dead on arrival, but it's certainly within less than 40 years, it's really proved how obsolete it already is. And it would need a complete rewriting. So maybe a synod could, at the very least, agree to rewrite it, to put together, a commission to rewrite it as, how do you say, on the basis of the principles such as those we are sharing here at this synod. You have principles of equality of participation, etc. And you just have to sort of codify them into law. I'm not saying it's an easy task, but it can be done, and I think it's an essential task that needs to be done.
Can I make a call?
Yes, Helena.
I mean, it's risible. How can it be acceptable that that the people who are, if you like, the people with power in a structure might be challenged over certain things, and they get to decide whether the challenge is valid or not? I mean, it's judges sitting in their own cause. Is a kind of ridiculous overturning of anything that we consider to be the proper ways in which justice is administered. So it is utterly wrong. I would like to see, coming out of this our root and branch efforts over this week, I would like to see us making as the key call an absolute revision of and a call for the creation of a commission to absolutely reform the canon law, and it will be a serious piece of work, and you have to have lay people involved in it as well as those who are within the hierarchy of the church, and it really has to be hearing evidence, and it has to sit in public hearing evidence, and it should systematically go through the structures of the canon law and make them appropriate to the 21st century. That should be our central main call going forward.
Thank you, Helena. Can we have one more question, please?
This last question, if it is the last one, says, several of our speakers this week have suggested that we should stop wasting energy on trying to lobby to change the current structures and laws of the church and just get on with making or being the change we wish to see. What are the panel's views about that?
I think we can chew and walk at the same time. I think that you do both. I think that you basically Sorry, that chew and walk thing came from President Ford in the United States, where people said that he couldn't chew and walk at the same time. Well, I think that most of us can. And what you do is you call for reform, you do the work on reform, and at the same time, you find your own expressions of your faith. You find your own ways of coming together with people who are like-minded, and you live out your Christianity and your Catholicism in a way that fits with your values, and so I think that you seek to do both.
But you stay within the institution, because changing from within, you have much more leverage than shouting from outside, and you also find opportunities to create situations and meetings and committees and all sorts of things where you can say, well, let's have so-and-so on it. Oh, she's lay. Gosh, that's a great idea, but she's an expert. So you change from within. Don't leave. Just make sure you have wonderful groups elsewhere that can keep you going.
Thank you. Okay, can we have the last question, Penelope?
Yes, this is more of a comment, and I've added it in because we haven't really touched much on priests who have had to leave to get married, and we can't go into the ordinariate, which are the Anglican priests who are married and have moved across to the Catholic Church with their families. But this person is saying, for those Catholic priests who had to leave to follow love and marriage and family life, what can we do to take them back in as soon as possible? Because this just seems totally unchristian.
Well, it goes back to my thing of saying that there are a number of key things to deal with early on, which are around the issue of celibacy of the priesthood. And once that was, if you untie that and say, yes, there can be celibate priests, but there can also be priests who are not celibate, and then it moves you towards the business of saying, and if we're doing that, then why can't we have women in the priesthood too? And that along with addressing the issue and I think the pain that is created for people who are gay and so on. If you start with doing those things, then you start unpicking the business of those who've had to leave in order to have a family life. And the great loss that has been to the church.
I think a significant number of women are lobbying for a complete change in the priesthood.
Yeah.
I mean, the current priesthood as it is today cannot continue because it is totally ineffective. And yes, hopefully we can, when that changes, then vocation will be open to everybody who's capable of being a leader. And again, the community elects, like we said in the beginning. So I am very grateful to my panel for being so efficient in answering so many questions, in putting across our thoughts so succinctly and clearly. As we concluded, there has to be change, especially canon law. Everyone in the church has to work towards change. All of us who are convinced have to get on board and work together. Today, we can join hands across the world to work towards this change. And Pope Francis, I always, I love his Evangelii Gaudium. And he says, he wants a church of accidents. He, go out and make a mess. So he wants us to come out into the street. And I think all of us lay people want to see change. We have to be the change. So let us get together and bring about that change and participate in the synodal process, even if our bishops leave us out. I think we should come together and have synods like this. No bishops initiated the synod. It is a lay initiated synod. So we can have our synods and we can throw our voices out there, We can throw our suggestions out there. I'm sure somebody would listen, because there are good men in that structure. There are good men, but you know what? They're scared. They're scared to open their mouths. There are good men in that structure. So let us throw our voices out there. Let's hope that significant number of those men will come down and join us and call for change in the church. So with that, I would like to close today's session of our authority panel. So over to you for the closing prayer.
This is a prayer that we've been saying for 18 months as volunteers for Root and Branch. It's quoted by Gerard Hughes in God of All Things by Charles Péguy, French poet and politician who died in 1914, but it has kept us going. I myself will dream a dream within you. Good dreams come from me, you know. My dreams seem impossible, not too practical, not for the cautious man or woman, a little risky sometimes, a trifle brash perhaps. Some of my friends prefer to rest more comfortably in sounder sleep with visionless eyes. But from those who share my dreams, I ask a little patience, a little humor, some small courage, and a listening heart. I will do the rest. Then they will risk and wonder at their daring, run and marvel at their speed, build and stand in awe at the beauty of their building.
You will meet me often as you work, in your companions who share the risk, in your friends who believe in you enough to lend their own hands, their own hearts to your building, in the people who will stand in your doorway, stay a while, and walk away knowing they too can find a dream. It will be sun-filled days, and sometimes it will rain. A little variety, both come from me. So come now, be content. It is my dream you dream, my house you build, my caring you witness, my love you share. And this is the heart